The morning shift at Eddie's Diner in Mansfield, Ohio, was waiting for Debra Lee Miller on April 29, 1981. But she never walked through those doors. At 18, with dreams of college and a gentle smile that brightened every room, Debra was the kind of neighbor everyone trusted. When worried coworkers knocked on her West 3rd Street apartment door, they found a scene that would haunt this quiet town for 43 years. Blood stained the kitchen floor. An oven grate lay beside her lifeless body. Upstairs lived James Vanest, 26, known for his temper and late-night pacing. But evidence was thin. Leads went nowhere, and whispers of police corruption clouded the investigation. Decades passed, hope faded. Then in 2021, advanced DNA testing changed everything. The genetic fingerprint was clear. But before justice could be served, Vanest vanished into the shadows. What happens when the truth finally catches up to a killer who thought he'd escaped forever? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning air hung thick with April dew when Debra Lee Miller's co-workers realized something was terribly wrong. She had never missed a shift at Eddie's Diner without calling. Never left her regulars wondering where their favorite waitress had gone. At barely 18, Debra possessed the kind of infectious optimism that made customers linger over coffee just to hear her laugh. Sarah Chen, the morning manager, knocked harder on the faded blue door of 847 West 3rd Street. No answer. Through the thin apartment walls, silence pressed back like a held breath. "Maybe she's sick," whispered Tom Bradley, the short order cook who'd driven Sarah over, but his voice carried no conviction. Debra would have called. She always called. The landlord's spare key turned with a metallic scrape that seemed to echo through the narrow hallway. Sarah pushed open the door and immediately stumbled backward into Tom's chest. The smell hit them first. Metallic wrong final. Then they saw her. Debra lay crumpled near the kitchen, her bright yellow uniform stained dark. Scattered around her body were the remnants of what had been a tidy life. Overturned chairs, a broken lamp, and most disturbing of all, a blood-stained oven grate that would become the investigation's central mystery. Had it been the weapon? The final blow that ended an 18-year-old's dreams. Sarah's scream brought neighbors running. Within minutes, sirens wailed down West 3rd Street, shattering the morning quiet of a town that rarely saw violence. Police cars lined the narrow road as Detective Ray Morrison sealed the scene with yellow tape that fluttered like funeral ribbons in the spring breeze. Detective Morrison had seen enough crime scenes to know this one would stick with him. The brutality spoke of rage of someone who knew Debra well enough to get close. As the coroner's team carefully documented each piece of evidence, Morrison's attention fixed on the apartment directly above. James Vanest answered the door with oil-stained hands and eyes that darted everywhere except Morrison's face. At 26, Vanest possessed the wiry build of a man who fixed things for a living. Cars, appliances, anything mechanical. But neighbors whispered about his temper, the way he paced the floors late at night, the occasional shouting matches with invisible adversaries. "Heard the commotion?" Vanest mumbled, wiping his palms on faded jeans. "Terrible thing about the girl downstairs." "When did you last see Debra?" Morrison asked, notepad ready. "Yesterday evening, maybe. She was always coming and going. Quiet type." Morrison studied Vanest's apartments. Sparse, obsessively organized tools arranged by size on a workbench by the window. Everything in its place except for a crowbar that lay slightly askew as if recently moved. "Mind if I take a look around?" "You got a warrant?" The defensive edge in Vanessa's voice made Morrison's instincts flare, but he had nothing concrete. No blood on Vanessa's clothes, no obvious signs of a struggle, just the gut feeling that something fundamental was wrong with this picture. Back at Mansfield Police Department that afternoon, Morrison spread crime scene photos across his desk. The oven grate bothered him most, an unusual choice of weapon if that's what it was. But without fingerprints or witnesses, the case felt like trying to hold smoke. "What do you think?" asked Detective Linda Hayes, Morrison's partner of 3 years. "I think our guy lives upstairs," Morrison replied. "Question is, can we prove it?" By morning, news of Debra Miller's murder had spread through Mansfield like wildfire. The Mansfield News Journal's headlines screamed across front pages. Local waitress found dead. Coffee shops buzzed with hushed conversations. Mothers walked their children to school with tighter grips on small hands. At Eddie's Diner, grief settled over the staff like a suffocating blanket. Sarah Chen could barely function, burning eggs and forgetting orders as she replayed finding Debra's body. Regular customers left flowers on the table where Debra always served coffee with extra cream and genuine interest in their lives. "She was special," whispered Mrs. Eleanor Reeves, an 80-year-old customer who'd claimed BU3 every Tuesday for 5 years. "That girl remembered my grandchildren's names. Asked about my Arthur's arthritis. Who does that anymore?" The investigation team canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, collecting statements, searching for anyone who'd seen or heard something unusual. Most responses were variations of the same theme. Debra was beloved, James Vanest was strange, and nobody could imagine why anyone would hurt such a sweet girl. Detective Morrison interviewed 12 neighbors that day. Each conversation added another layer to Debra's character. Kind, hard-working, dreaming of nursing school, and deepened. The mystery of who could have wanted her dead. The brutality of the crime suggested personal rage, but Debra seemed to inspire only affection from those who knew her. As evening approached, candles appeared on doorsteps along West 3rd Street. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, sharing memories and theories in equal measure. Mrs. Gladys Henderson, who lived 2 doors down, organized an impromptu vigil. "We can't let her be forgotten," she said, lighting the first candle with trembling fingers. Debra's mother, Janet Miller, arrived just as the sun was setting. A woman of quiet strength who'd raised 4 children after her husband's death. Janet stood before the crowd with dignity that humbled everyone present. She held Debra's senior portrait, that radiant smile captured forever at 17, and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "My daughter believed in the goodness of people. She saw light where others saw a shadow. If you knew Debra, you know she'd want us to keep believing too." The gathered neighbors wept openly. Candles flickered in the growing darkness, and Janet Miller clutched her daughter's photograph, beginning a vigil that would last 43 years. 1 week after the murder, the Mansfield Police Department evidence room held the physical remnants of Debra Lee Miller's last moments. Detective Morrison stood before the metal shelves, cataloging each bagged item with the methodical precision of a man who understood that details might be the difference between justice and failure. The bloodstained oven grate occupied the center position. Tagged and photographed from every angle, forensic analysis confirmed it as the likely murder weapon, showing hair and tissue consistent with blunt force trauma. But fingerprints were smudged beyond recognition, and 1981 technology offered no way to analyze the biological material clinging to its surface. Evidence. Bag. #7 contained fingernail scrapings from Debra's body cells that might belong to her killer, frozen in time, waiting for science to catch up. Bag #2 held fabric fibers from her uniform, some foreign, possibly from her attacker's clothing. Bag #23 contained swabs from the crime scene, dark with what forensics confirmed as blood from 2 different sources. "Debra's and someone else's. We've got everything documented," Morrison told Detective Hayes as they reviewed the inventory. "Problem is, we can't do anything meaningful with half of it." The biological evidence represented their best hope and greatest frustration. DNA analysis existed in university laboratories, but the technology remained experimental, expensive, and unavailable to small-town police departments. The trace evidence that might conclusively identify Debra's killer sat inches away, scientifically useless. Morrison had interrogated James Vanest 3 more times that week, each session revealing nothing new. Vanest maintained his innocence with the flat effect of a man discussing the weather. No alibi for the night of the murder. He'd been home alone as usual, but no concrete evidence linking him to the crime either. "This is going cold," Hayes said, voicing what they both knew. Morrison sealed the evidence bags with growing frustration. Somewhere in these containers lay the key to solving Debra Miller's murder. The killer's identity was probably recorded in blood cells and skin fragments, locked away by technological limitations and departmental budgets. "Not on my watch," Morrison vowed, though he feared time would prove him wrong. By summer 1981, the Debra Miller case had begun its slow descent into the police department's cold case files. Detective Morrison found himself reassigned to active investigations. While Debra's murder gathered dust between reports on burglaries and bar fights, but whispers had started circulating through Mansfield. Ugly rumors that poisoned the investigation as surely as any destroyed evidence. Anonymous calls to the police department suggested corruption, claiming some officers had been romantically involved with Debra. While no evidence supported these allegations, the story spread through coffee shops and church gatherings like an infection. They botched the scene, insisted Harold Murphy, a local mechanic who'd appointed himself expert on police procedure. Everyone knows they compromised evidence, probably covering for one of their own. The rumors found fertile ground in a community hungry for answers. Why hadn't anyone been arrested? How could such a brutal murder go unsolved in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business? The questions multiplied, and when answers didn't come, suspicion filled the void. Detective Hayes fielded increasingly hostile calls from residents demanding updates. "People are scared," she told Morrison over coffee in the station break room. When they're scared and confused, they need someone to blame. Morrison understood the psychology, but felt helpless to combat it. The investigation had stalled not through incompetence, but through lack of evidence. James Vanest remained their primary suspect, but suspicion wasn't proof, and the district attorney wouldn't authorize charges based on proximity and personality conflicts. The final blow came in August when Lieutenant William Torres called Morrison into his office. "I'm reassigning you to property crimes," Torres said without preamble. "The Miller case is being transferred to the cold case division." "Sir, I've been working this for 4 months. I know every detail, which is exactly why you need fresh perspective elsewhere. Detective Collins will handle any new developments." Morrison cleaned out his desk that afternoon, boxing files that had consumed his waking thoughts for months. The evidence remained in storage, waiting. Debra Miller's photograph stared up at him from the case folder, her smile a silent accusation of failure. Outside, Mansfield continued its daily routines while a killer walked free. 5 years had transformed Mansfield in subtle ways. New businesses replaced old ones on Main Street. Young families moved in as older residents passed away or relocated. But on West 3rd Street, nothing changed. Janet Miller still kept flowers on her daughter's doorstep every Tuesday, still lit candles in the window every night, still waited for phone calls that never came. The Mansfield Police Department had undergone its own evolution. New leadership promised accountability and transparency, pledging to review all cold cases with fresh eyes and modern techniques. Detective Morris Campbell, hired from Cleveland PD specifically to handle unsolved crimes, reopened the Miller file in June 1986. Campbell spread 26 evidence bags across his desk, reading 5 years of accumulated reports, witness statements, and investigative notes. The case had grown thick with documentation but thin on progress. James Vanest had moved twice but remained in the area, working odd jobs, accumulating minor arrests for theft and disorderly conduct. Still suspicious, still free. "Tell me about the original investigation," Campbell asked Detective Hayes, who'd remained with the department through the transition. Ray Morrison was convinced Vanest was our guy. Had good instincts, but the evidence just wasn't there. Still isn't. Campbell studied crime scene photographs, focusing on details previous investigators might have missed. The oven grate bothered him too. Such a specific weapon suggested either opportunity or symbolism. Had the killer grabbed the first available object, or was there meaning in using something associated with cooking, nurturing domestic life? 3 weeks of renewed investigation yielded little new information. Neighbors who'd been questioned in 1981 had moved away or forgotten details. Physical evidence remained locked in technological limitations. The biological samples that might identify the killer sat uselessly in storage, waiting for scientific advances that seemed perpetually just out of reach. Janet Miller visited Campbell's office monthly, a ritual of hope and disappointment that broke the detective's heart. She'd aged a decade in 5 years, grief carving lines around her eyes and mouth, but her determination never wavered. "She visits her daughter's apartment every week," Campbell wrote in his final report. "Sits on the front steps for exactly 30 minutes, talking to the air as if Debra might answer back. The new tenants don't complain, they understand." By Christmas 1986, the Miller case returned to cold storage. Another detective had tried, failed, and moved on. The cycle would repeat. The 1990s brought scandal to the Mansfield Police Department, a corruption investigation that validated years of whispered suspicions. 3 officers were arrested for evidence tampering, 2 for accepting bribes, and the entire detective division underwent reorganization. In the chaos, cold cases like Debra Miller's received renewed attention from internal affairs investigators seeking to understand the full scope of departmental failure. Detective Sarah Martinez, hired during the cleanup process, inherited a dozen unsolved murders dating back to 1978. The Miller case stood out not for its complexity, but for the completeness of its evidence preservation. Despite rumors of tampering, The physical evidence had been properly stored and documented, unusual for cases from that era. Someone cared enough to do this right, Martinez observed, reviewing the meticulous chain of custody records. Detective Morrison's work, though unsuccessful, had been thorough and professional. The evidence remained intact, properly frozen, waiting for technology to make it relevant. Martinez spent 3 months re-interviewing everyone connected to the case. James Vanest, now 38, worked at an auto repair shop in nearby Ontario. Still single, still prone to angry outbursts, still claiming innocence with dead eyes and flat affect. His criminal record had expanded to include assault charges and weapons violations, painting a picture of escalating antisocial behavior. He's gotten worse over the years, reported his current boss. Reliable worker, but you don't want to cross him. Has a mean streak wide as the interstate. New witnesses emerged from the re-examination. Mrs. Dorothy Phillips, who'd lived across the street in 1981, remembered hearing raised voices from Debra's apartment the night before the murder. She'd assumed it was the television, but now wondered if she'd witnessed the killer's final argument with his victim. "Why didn't you report this originally?" Martinez asked. "Nobody asked specifically about sounds. They asked if I saw anything unusual. I didn't see anything." The distinction highlighted how thoroughly investigations could miss crucial details through imprecise questioning. Martinez documented Phillips' account and submitted it to the district attorney, but the passage of time had made the evidence legally problematic. Memories fade, witnesses die, and justice becomes increasingly difficult to achieve. By December 1995, Martinez had compiled the most complete picture of Debra Miller's murder ever assembled. But like her predecessors, she lacked the one element that could transform suspicion into conviction: definitive proof. Time moved differently in the Miller household. While the world outside embraced new millennium celebrations and technological revolutions, Janet Miller's calendar remained frozen at April 29, 1981. Debra's bedroom stayed exactly as it had been, textbooks stacked on the desk. Nursing program applications still waiting on the nightstand. A half-finished letter to her aunt folded inside a copy of Janeer. Janet had transformed grief into routine. Every morning she'd prepare 2 cups of coffee, drinking one while talking to Debra's senior portrait, propped against the sugar bowl. The second cup would cool untouched, then be poured down the sink after exactly 30 minutes. Every evening she'd light a candle in the front window, a beacon for a daughter who would never come home. Her surviving children worried about her obsession. "Mom, you need to move on," her son Michael would say during weekly visits. "Debra wouldn't want you living like this." But Janet couldn't move on because the world hadn't moved on. Her daughter's killer walked free, probably lived nearby, might shop in the same grocery store or attend the same church. How could she find peace when justice remained undone? The 20th anniversary of Debra's murder brought another wave of media attention. The Mansfield News Journal ran a retrospective series titled "Still Waiting for Justice," featuring interviews with family members and a timeline of the investigation's failures. Local television stations picked up the story, broadcasting Janet Miller's quiet plea for anyone with information to finally come forward. The publicity generated 43 phone tips in 2 weeks. 42 led nowhere: old grievances against neighbors, conspiracy theories about government cover-ups, and false confessions from mentally disturbed individuals seeking attention. The 43rd call came from an unexpected source. James Vanest's ex-girlfriend Lisa Morrison, no relation to the original detective, had dated Vanest briefly in 1987. He used to talk about that murdered girl. She told Detective Martinez said everyone suspected him, that he'd never be free of it. But sometimes when he'd been drinking, he'd say things like, "They can't prove what they can't understand." Martinez pressed for specifics. What exactly had Vanest said? When had these conversations occurred? Could Lisa provide any documentation? "I was scared of him," Lisa admitted. "That's why I left. He had this way of looking at you when he was angry, like he was calculating how much damage he could do. I never forgot that look." The interview added psychological texture to the case, but no legal substance. Still, Martinez felt the investigation creeping closer to truth. Detective Marcus Thompson inherited the Debra Miller case in 2021, 40 years after an 18-year-old waitress had died brutally in a small apartment on West 3rd Street. Unlike his predecessors, Thompson had access to forensic tools that seemed almost supernatural compared to 1981's investigative capabilities. DNA analysis, once experimental and expensive, had become routine and relatively affordable. The Mansfield Police Department had received a federal grant specifically for cold case investigations, part of a nationwide initiative to apply modern science to decades-old mysteries. Thompson, hired from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, specialized in genetic genealogy and advanced forensic techniques that could extract information from evidence previously considered worthless. "We're going to solve this one," Thompson told his lieutenant with confidence his predecessors had never felt. "The technology exists. The evidence is intact. We just need to connect the dots." The evidence room hadn't changed much in 4 decades. The same metal shelves held the same carefully labeled bags, waiting for science to catch up with ambition. Thompson examined each item with the reverence of an archaeologist handling ancient artifacts. Bag #23, containing blood swabs from the crime scene, represented his best hope for breakthrough. The Ohio State Crime Lab had agreed to prioritize the Miller case for DNA extraction and analysis. New techniques could potentially develop genetic profiles from biological samples that would have been useless just 5 years earlier. If the preserved blood came from Debra's killer, and if that killer's DNA existed in any criminal database, the case could be solved within weeks. Thompson drove the evidence to Columbus personally, unwilling to trust such precious cargo to shipping companies or courier services. At the crime lab, he handed the samples to Dr. Patricia Chen, a forensic geneticist who'd solved 12 cold cases in the past year using similar evidence. "So how long has this been waiting?" Dr. Chen asked, examining the preservation quality. 40 years? Then let's see if we can finally give this family some answers." Thompson returned to Mansfield with guarded optimism. The evidence was in capable hands. Now came the hardest part of any investigation: waiting. The Ohio State Crime Lab operated with the sterile precision of a space program. Dr. Patricia Chen had spent 15 years coaxing genetic secrets from evidence that other forensic scientists had declared hopeless. Degraded DNA, contaminated samples, microscopic traces of biological material. She'd learned to find needles in haystacks by redefining what constituted a needle. The Debra Miller evidence presented an interesting challenge. Blood samples preserved in 1981 using techniques that were state-of-the-art at the time, but primitive by current standards. The freezing process had caused cellular breakdown, but enough genetic material remained to attempt extraction. Chen began with the most promising sample. Dried blood scraped from the oven grate that had likely killed Debra Miller. Under microscopic examination, the sample showed clear separation between 2 distinct blood types. One belonged to the victim, that much had been established decades earlier. The second source remained unknown, presumably belonging to the killer. The extraction process required painstaking care. Chen isolated cells from the unknown blood source, then used polymerase chain reaction amplification to multiply the genetic material until it reached testable quantity. The resulting DNA profile contained 13 usable markers, enough for comparison against criminal databases, but not enough to satisfy her perfectionist standards. "Let me try the fingernail scrapings," Chen told her assistant. "If the victim scratched her attacker, we might get cleaner DNA." Evidence bag #7 yielded better results. Skin cells trapped under Debra's fingernails had been perfectly preserved by the freezing process, protected from contamination by careful evidence handling. This sample produced a full genetic profile with 24 usable markers, more than enough for definitive identification. Chen uploaded the profile to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, and waited. The database contained genetic profiles from millions of criminals, sex offenders, and arrestees. If Debra Miller's killer had ever been arrested for a felony, his DNA would be in the system. The computer search took 17 minutes. When results appeared on her screen, Chen stared for a long moment before reaching for the phone. After 4 decades of mystery, Debra Miller's killer had a name: James Edward Vanest. The DNA match showed probability of random coincidence at less than 1 in 40 billion. Scientifically, it was as close to certainty as genetics could provide. Detective Thompson received the call while reviewing traffic accident reports, routine work that suddenly seemed trivial compared to the voice on the other end of the line. Dr. Chen's words transformed 40 years of frustration into vindication, speculation into certainty, suspicion into proof. "James Edward vanished," Thompson repeated, writing the name in block letters across his notepad. "You're absolutely certain? As certain as DNA analysis can make me." The genetic profile from your crime scene matches perfectly with a sample we have on file from a 2019 weapons arrest. Same individual, no question. Thompson ended the call and sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Every detective who'd worked the Miller case had suspected Vanest, but suspicion and proof existed in different universes. Now science had bridged that gap with mathematical precision. Within an hour, Thompson had assembled a briefing for the department's leadership. Lieutenant Maria Santos listened to the DNA findings with growing excitement, understanding the implications immediately. The Miller case wasn't just another cold case closure. It represented redemption for decades of investigative frustration and community doubt. "What's our next move?" Santos asked. "We need to locate Vanest and coordinate with the district attorney's office. After 40 years, we want this arrest to go perfectly." Thompson spent the afternoon researching Vanessa's current status. Still living in the area, still working automotive repair, still accumulating minor criminal charges with predictable regularity. His 2019 arrest had been for illegal firearms possession. Apparently, he'd been selling modified weapons to gang members in Cleveland. The conviction had resulted in 18 months in federal prison and mandatory DNA collection for the criminal database. Ironic justice. Vanest's attempt to profit from illegal weapons had provided the genetic evidence that would finally convict him for murder. The district attorney's office agreed to fast-track the case. Prosecutor Elena Rodriguez had never handled a DNA-based cold case, but she understood the significance. 40 years is a long time to wait for justice, she told Thompson. "Let's make sure we get this right." Grand jury indictment papers were prepared in secret. Arrest warrants were signed by Judge William McCarthy, the same jurist who'd presided over numerous failed attempts to solve the Miller case. Everything was ready except for one crucial detail. Finding James Vanest, Janet Miller was tending her garden when Detective Thompson knocked on her door. At 78, she moved more slowly than in previous decades, but her hands remained steady as she arranged roses in a vase flower she'd plant on Debra's grave. Later that afternoon, continuing a ritual that had never missed a Tuesday in 40 years, Thompson had rehearsed this conversation during the drive over. How do you tell a grieving mother that her worst suspicions have been confirmed? How do you balance hope with the sobering reality that her daughter's killer had lived freely for 4 decades while she suffered? "Mrs. Miller, I have some news about Debra's case." Janet set down the vase and looked directly into Thompson's eyes. After 40 years of disappointing updates, she'd learned to read detective faces like weather patterns. This one was different. "You found something. We have DNA evidence that identifies your daughter's killer, James Vanest." The name hung between them like a physical present. Janet had spoken it countless times over the decades, usually preceded by phrases like, "I think," or "probably," or "if only we could prove." Now it carried the weight of scientific certainty. "I always knew," she whispered. "From the very beginning I knew it was him." But knowing and proving, she trailed off, tears forming in eyes that had cried themselves dry years ago. Thompson explained the DNA analysis, the codism match, the legal preparations already in motion. Janet listened with the focused attention of someone who'd waited half a lifetime for this moment. When he finished, she sat quietly for several minutes, processing 40 years of grief and frustration. "What happens now?" she asked. "We arrest him. He'll face trial for Debra's murder. After all this time, there will finally be justice. Will you tell me when you catch him? You'll be the first person I call." Janet stood and walked to the mantelpiece where Debra's senior portrait had watched over the family for 4 decades. She touched the frame gently, a gesture of love that had become automatic. "Did you hear that, baby? They finally know the truth." Thompson left the Miller house with mixed emotions. Justice was coming, but it felt incomplete somehow. 40 years too late, purchased with decades of a mother's anguish. Still, it was better than never. James Vanest had developed a routine over 40 years of freedom. Every morning at 6 a.m., he'd drive from his small apartment in Ontario to Mansfield Auto Repair, where he'd spend 8 hours fixing other people's broken machines. He was good at his job, methodical, precise, able to diagnose problems that stumped younger mechanics. But coworkers learned not to engage him in conversation, especially about personal topics. Vanest radiated a darkness that made small talk feel dangerous. Detective Thompson and U.S. Marshal Robert Hayes began surveillance on a gray Tuesday morning in March 2022. The arrest needed to be clean, public, witnessed by enough people to prevent any claims of police misconduct. Too much was at stake after 4 decades of waiting. He looks older, but not different. Thompson observed through binoculars as Vanest emerged from his apartment building. Same dead expression. Same way of moving like he's angry at the world. The arrest plan was simple. Wait until Vanest arrived at work, then approach with overwhelming force before he could react violent. Psychological profiles suggested he'd been living with guilty knowledge for 40 years, always expecting this moment. Cornered animals were dangerous, and Vanest had proven himself capable of extraordinary brutality. But as the arrest team assembled at 7:30 a.m. outside Mansfield Auto Repair, they discovered an empty parking space where Vanest's truck should have been. The shop manager confirmed he'd called in sick that morning, unusual for someone who'd barely missed a day in 3 years. Thompson felt ice forming in his stomach. Had someone tipped off Vanest? Was he running? After waiting 40 years for justice, had the killer slipped away at the crucial moment? A canvas of Vanest's apartment building revealed his truck was gone, along with several suitcases and most of his tools. Neighbors reported seeing him loading boxes into his vehicle around midnight, 12 hours before the planned arrest. He's in the wind, Marshal Hayes concluded grimly. Question is, how far did he get? Thompson stared at the empty apartment, feeling 40 years of investigative work crumbling. Somewhere out there, James Vanest was driving toward an uncertain destination, carrying the weight of murder and the knowledge that science had finally caught up with his past. The manhunt for James Vanest consumed 3 years and covered 11 states. U.S. Marshals tracked him through security footage, credit card transactions, and cellular phone records, always arriving hours or days too late. Vanest had planned his escape well, using skills learned during 4 decades of avoiding serious consequences for increasingly serious crime. Marshal Robert Hayes coordinated the search from a task force office in Cleveland, surrounded by maps marked with red pins, indicating confirmed sighting. Vanest had been spotted in West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Florida, working odd jobs under false identities, staying in cheap motel that accepted cash and asked few questions. He's got survival instincts, Hayes told his team during a briefing in January 2024. Knows how to disappear, how to blend in, but he's also getting desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. The mistake came in November 2024, ironically connected to Vanest's lifelong pattern of weapon-related crimes. Canton police arrested him during a routine traffic stop, discovering modified firearms in his truck bed. The guns were illegal, the modifications were federal crimes, and the serial numbers had been filed off enough charges to hold him. While marshals confirmed his identity through fingerprints, but Vanest had learned to read law enforcement faces, as well as Janet Miller had learned to read detective expressions. When the arresting officer's demeanor changed after running his prints, when additional units arrived without explanation, when questions shifted from weapons charges to requests for DNA samples, he understood his 4-decade flight was ending. The Canton area motel where they'd cornered him was unremarkable. 2 stories of faded brick and flickering neon. The kind of place that rented rooms by the week to people with nowhere else to go. Room 237 had become Vanest's fortress and his tomb. James Vanest, this is U.S. Marshals, Hayes called through the door. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 1981 murder of Debra Lee Miller. Open the door and come out with your hands visible. The response was immediate. Gunfire through the thin door. Bullets splintering wood and embedding themselves in the hallway wall. Marshal Jessica Rodriguez took shrapnel in her shoulder, but kept position returning fire while Hayes coordinated evacuation of adjacent rooms. The standoff lasted 6 hours. When silence finally returned to room 237, James Vanest laid dead on carpeting stained with 43 years of secrets. Dr. Patricia Chen had processed thousands of DNA samples during her career, but the post-mortem analysis of James Vanest carried unusual emotional weight. This wasn't just another comparison of genetic markers. This was the final confirmation that a 43-year journey toward justice had reached its destination. The sample collection had been complicated by the circumstances of Vanest's death. Multiple gunshot wounds had contaminated some biological material, but Chen's team managed to extract sufficient DNA from blood samples taken during the autopsy. The genetic profile they developed was compared against the evidence from Debra Miller's crime scene, using the most advanced analytical techniques available. Perfect match, Chen reported to Detective Thompson during a phone call that officially closed 4 decades of uncertainty. 24 markers. Probability of coincidence less than 1 in 80 billion. James Edward Vanest killed Debra Lee Miller on April 29, 1981. Thompson sat in his office staring at case files that had consumed 2 years of his professional life and touched the hearts of an entire community. The DNA evidence eliminated any possibility of doubt, but it also eliminated any possibility of traditional justice. There would be no trial, no verdict, no moment when Debra's family could watch her killer face consequences in a courtroom. The scientific conclusion felt simultaneously complete and incomplete. Truth had been established, but closure remained elusive. Justice, it turned out, was more complicated than genetic matches in laboratory reports. Lieutenant Santos approved Thompson's recommendation to officially close the case. After 43 years, 16 different investigators, and countless hours of community anguish, the Debra Miller murder file could finally be marked solved. But the designation felt oddly anticlimactic. "How do you feel?" Santos asked as Thompson completed the final paperwork, relieved that we know the truth. Frustrated that it took so long, sad that Vanest never faced trial, Thompson paused, considering the complexity of emotions surrounding cold case resolutions, mostly grateful that Mrs. Miller lived to see this day. The case had been solved not through brilliant detective work or dramatic breakthroughs, but through the patient application of scientific advancement to carefully preserved evidence. In the end, justice had arrived wearing a laboratory coat rather than a police uniform. December 31, 2024, marked the end of a year that had transformed grief into resolution for the Miller family and vindication for the Mansfield Police Department. The press conference announcing the case closure drew reporters from across Ohio, reflecting public fascination with cold cases and the power of DNA science to reach across decades. Chief Patricia Williams stood at the podium in Mansfield City Hall, surrounded by American flags and photographs documenting the investigation's long history. Behind her sat Janet Miller, now 79, flanked by her surviving children and grandchildren who'd grown up hearing stories about the aunt they'd never met. After 43 years, 8 months, and 2 days, we can finally say with scientific certainty that the murder of Debra Lee Miller has been solved, Chief Williams announced. DNA evidence conclusively identifies James Edward Vanest as her killer. The assembled reporters scribbled notes and held recording devices closer, recognizing the significance of the moment. Cold cases rarely achieve such definitive resolution, especially after 4 decades of investigative dead ends. Detective Thompson took the podium next, explaining the technological advances that had made the breakthrough possible. He spoke about preserved evidence, genetic databases, and the patient work of forensic scientists who coaxed truth from decades-old biological samples. "This case demonstrates why we never give up on seeking justice," Thompson said. "Technology evolves, techniques improve, and sometimes science catches up with evidence that's been waiting patiently in storage." Janet Miller's statement was brief but powerful. She thanked the investigators who'd never stopped trying, the community members who'd never stopped caring, and the scientists who'd finally provided the answers her family needed. "Debra would have been 61 years old this year," Janet said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "She never got to become the nurse she dreamed of being, never got to have the family she wanted, never got to see how beautiful the world could be. But she didn't die for nothing. Her case shows that truth has its own timeline, and justice can wait decades if necessary." The press conference concluded with questions about the investigation's future impact. Would other cold cases receive similar attention? How many unsolved murders might be resolved through DNA technology? Chief Williams promised that Debra Miller's case would not be the last, that the department was committed to applying modern science to historical mysteries. Outside City Hall, candles appeared as news of the announcement spread. Mansfield residents gathered spontaneously, creating an impromptu memorial that stretched along Federal Plaza. The flame that Janet Miller had kept burning in her window for 43 years had multiplied into hundreds of lights held by neighbors who remembered. The vigil at Debra's former apartment on West 3rd Street drew nearly 200 people on the first Friday evening of January 2025. Neighbors who'd known her, coworkers from Eddie's Diner who'd mourned her loss, and strangers who'd followed the case through decades of news coverage came together in the cold night air to honor a young woman whose death had defined their community's understanding of injustice and perseverance. Someone had placed a wreath on the front steps where Sarah Chen had discovered Debra's body 44 years earlier. Flowers surrounded the memorial, roses, lies, daisies, creating a garden of remembrance that transformed a site of horror into a shrine of love. Mrs. Eleanor Reeves, now 96 and using a walker, had been helped to the gathering by her granddaughter. "I never forgot her smile," she told the assembled crowd. "That girl had light in her eyes that made you feel like the world was good. Tonight we celebrate that light." Janet Miller stood before the apartment building where her daughter had lived and died, holding a paper lantern that glowed softly in the winter darkness. The ritual had been her granddaughter's idea, a way to symbolically release Debra's spirit from the earthbound concerns that had kept her memory trapped in grief. "3 years ago, a monster took my daughter's life," Janet said, her words carrying across the silent crowd. "But he couldn't take her love, her kindness, or the way she made people feel special. Those things lived on in all of you, in every person who remembered her smile, who shared her story, who refused to let her be forgotten." The crowd lit candles from Janet's lantern, passing flame from person to person until West 3rd Street flickered with dozens of small lights. Children who'd been born decades after Debra's death held candles beside adults who'd served her coffee at Eddie's Diner. At precisely 8:47 p.m., the estimated time of Debra's death, based on forensic analysis, Janet released her lantern into the winter sky. The glowing orb rose slowly, carrying with it 4 decades of accumulated sorrow and the community's collective hope for peace. Other lanterns followed, creating a constellation of lights that drifted over Mansfield like souls finally free to find rest. The crowd watched in silence until the last glow disappeared beyond the horizon. Then began the slow dispersal that marked the end of their long vigil. February brought the difficult task of dismantling the shrine that Debra's bedroom had become. Janet Miller's children had gently suggested this step for years. But only now, with her daughter's killer identified and justice achieved, did it feel emotionally possible to pack away the artifacts of interrupted dreams. Michael Miller helped his mother fold the nursing textbooks that had waited on Debra's desk for 44 years. The pages had yellowed with age, and medical knowledge had evolved beyond recognition. But the books represented aspirations that death had frozen in time. "She would have been a wonderful nurse," Janet said, running her fingers across an anatomy diagram. Debra had annotated with careful notes. "She had such gentle hands, such a caring heart. People would have felt safe with her." The half-finished letter to Aunt Patricia was perhaps the most heartbreaking artifact. Debra had been describing her excitement about the coming summer, her plans to save money for college, her hope that life was finally beginning to open up with possibilities. The letter ended mid-sentence, pen stopped by violence that had erupted without warning. Each item carried memories that Janet shared with her son as they worked. The jewelry box that played Fur Elise when opened, Debra's favorite piece from childhood. The diary hidden beneath sweaters in the bottom drawer filled with the hopes and fears of an 18-year-old navigating adulthood. The collection of romance novels that had inspired dreams of finding true love. "What should we do with everything?" Michael asked. Janet had considered this question for weeks. Simply storing the items felt like creating another shrine. Donating them seemed impersonal. Finally, she decided on a solution that honored both Debra's memory and her compassionate nature. The nursing textbooks go to the Community College Scholarship Fund. Her clothes get donated to the women's shelter. Her books go to the library. Janet paused at the jewelry box, listening to the familiar melody one last time. "This stays with me." They worked through the afternoon, transforming a museum of grief into empty space that could finally breathe again. When finished, the room held only furniture and the faint scent of the lavender sachets Debra had loved. That evening, Janet Miller slept peacefully for the first time in 44 years. Her daughter's possessions had found new purposes, but more importantly, her daughter's story had found its ending. The Mansfield Community Forum on Unsolved Crimes drew standing room-only crowds to the Central Christian Church Fellowship Hall in March 2025. Families of murder victims, concerned citizens, and law enforcement officials gathered to discuss how Debra Miller's case might serve as a model for resolving other cold cases. Chief Williams opened the session by acknowledging the community's role in keeping Debra's memory alive. This case was solved not just through DNA technology, but through 44 years of people who refused to forget, who continued to care, who demanded accountability from their police department. The forum featured presentations from DNA experts, cold case specialists, and victim advocacy groups. Dr. Patricia Chen explained how genetic genealogy was revolutionizing forensic science, making it possible to solve cases that previous generations of investigators had considered hopeless. Every piece of biological evidence preserved from historical crime scenes represents potential closure for grieving families. Dr. Chen said, "The technology exists. The question is whether communities will invest in applying it systematically." Families of other unsolved murders shared their stories. The Patterson family, whose son had been killed in 1994, described their ongoing quest for answers. The Rodriguez family spoke about their daughter's 2003 disappearance and their hope that DNA evidence might someday provide resolution. Janet Miller's address to the forum carried special weight as the representative of a family that had finally achieved closure. She spoke about the importance of preserving evidence, supporting dedicated investigators, and maintaining hope even when years passed without progress. "I want other families to know that giving up is not required," Janet said. "Grief changes over time, but it doesn't have to become despair. Sometimes justice moves slowly, but it can still arrive." The forum concluded with the announcement of a new initiative, the Debra Miller Cold Case Fund, established to provide resources for DNA analysis of preserved evidence from unsolved murders. Community donations and state grants would support laboratory costs that many departments couldn't afford. Detective Thompson volunteered to coordinate the program. Understanding that Debra's case had given him both professional purpose and personal mission. Other cold cases deserve the same attention, the same scientific resources, the same commitment to truth that had finally identified her killer. Outside the church, spring flowers were beginning to bloom. The season of renewal felt appropriate for a community ready to tackle old mysteries with new determination. The Ohio State Crime Lab designated a special wing for cold case DNA analysis in June 2025. Partially funded by federal grants and community donations inspired by the Miller case resolution, Dr. Patricia Chen was appointed director of the new division, tasked with systematically reviewing biological evidence from hundreds of unsolved murders dating back to the 1,172nd. The laboratory buzzed with quiet efficiency as technicians processed evidence that had waited decades for analysis. Each case represented a family still seeking answers, a community still carrying unresolved trauma, an opportunity for science to reach across time and deliver justice. "We're not just analyzing DNA," Dr. Chen told her team during orientation. "We're reuniting families with truth, giving closure to people who've waited lifetimes for answers. This is sacred work." The Debra Miller case had established protocols that other investigations could follow. Evidence preservation techniques, chain of custody procedures, database search methodologies. Every aspect of the successful resolution was documented and standardized for future use. 3 cases were solved in the program's first month. A 19985 rape and murder in Toledo yielded a DNA match to a convicted sex offender who died in prison years earlier. A 1992 double homicide in Akron was linked to a man currently serving time for armed robbery. A 1997 killing in Youngstown produced a genetic profile that led investigators to an Ohio truck driver who confessed when confronted with the evidence. Each resolution followed a similar pattern: scientific analysis, database searches, family notifications, media announcements, and community healing. The process had become routine, but the emotional impact never diminished. Young forensic scientists joined the program specifically to work on cold cases, inspired by stories of families like the Millers, who'd waited decades for justice. They understood that their work connected past and present, victim and survivor, evidence and resolution. "Every sample tells a story," said intern Rebecca Martinez, examining a blood specimen from a 1,989 case. "Our job is to make sure those stories finally get heard." The laboratory maintained a wall of photographs showing victims whose cases had been solved through DNA analysis. Debra Miller's senior portrait held the place of honor, her radiant smile watching over scientists who continued the work her death had inspired. September 2025 brought the dedication of a memorial garden in Mansfield, South Park, designed to honor victims of unsolved crimes and families who'd never stopped seeking justice. The Debra Miller Memorial Garden featured a central fountain surrounded by walking paths and benches, where visitors could sit quietly and remember loved ones taken by violence. Janet Miller cut the ribbon at the dedication ceremony, surrounded by families whose own journeys toward justice continued. The garden represented hope rather than despair, possibility rather than finality. Its design emphasized life and growth rather than death and endings. Debra loved flowers, Janet told the gathered crowd. She used to say that gardens proved the world was basically good, because who would plant something beautiful if they didn't believe in tomorrow? This garden is her kind of memorial, something that grows and changes and brings comfort to people who need it. Bronze plaques along the walking paths contained quotes from victims' families, investigators who'd never given up, and community members who'd supported long searches for truth. The central fountain was inscribed with words Debra had written in her diary just weeks before her death. Tomorrow feels full of possibilities. Detective Thompson spoke about the memorial's significance for law enforcement. This garden reminds us that every unsolved case represents real people who were loved and are missed. It's not just about closing files or solving puzzles. It's about restoring wholeness to families and communities that violence has fractured. The ceremony included readings from letters written by families of murder victims across Ohio, many expressing gratitude for renewed attention to cold cases. The Debra Miller case had inspired a statewide initiative to review unsolved homicides using modern DNA technology, with funding allocated for laboratory analysis and investigative resources. Local school children had planted the flower beds under guidance from master gardener volunteers. As seasons changed, the garden would bloom and grow, evolve, and renew itself. A living symbol of resilience that honored the dead while affirming life's continuing power. The dedication concluded as sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Families walked the garden paths together, finding comfort in shared understanding and collective hope for justice that might still come. The first annual Mansfield Police Memorial Service in October 2025 honored not just fallen officers, but also victims of unsolved crimes whose cases had touched the department's history. The ceremony took place at the new Memorial Garden, where a granite wall now displayed names of murder victims whose cases remained open alongside those finally resolved. Debra Lee Miller's name was etched prominently on the solved section of the memorial, her case serving as inspiration for continued work on other mysteries. Chief Williams read each name aloud during the ceremony, acknowledging lives cut short and families still seeking answers. Every name represents a story that deserves completion. Chief Williams said, "Some stories end with justice served. Others remain unfinished chapters. Our commitment is to never stop writing, never stop seeking the truth these families need." The memorial wall design allowed for names to be moved from unsolved to solved as cases were resolved. Since Debra's case closure, 3 other Mansfield murders had been solved through DNA analysis, demonstrating the ongoing power of scientific advancement applied to historical evidence. Janet Miller spoke on behalf of families who'd achieved closure. Her words carried the wisdom of someone who'd traveled the complete journey from devastating loss through decades of uncertainty to final resolution. "Standing here today, I can tell families still waiting that hope is not foolish," Janet said. "Justice moves on its own timeline, but it can still arrive." The investigators who worked Debra's case across 4 decades never gave up. The community never forgot her. And finally, science caught up with truth. The ceremony concluded with the planting of a white oak tree in the Memorial Garden Center. The tree would grow slowly but steadily, its expanding canopy eventually shading the entire memorial. Like justice itself, the tree represented patience, persistence, and faith in eventual flourishing. As autumn leaves fell around the new memorial, Mansfield residents walked among the plaques and flower beds, reading names and reflecting on the fragility of life and the endurance of love. The garden had become a place of pilgrimage for families seeking comfort and communities grappling with loss. Winter returned to West 3rd Street with the gentle persistence of seasons that marked time's passage, regardless of human joy or sorrow. Snow covered the sidewalks where neighbors had gathered 44 years earlier, to mourn an 18-year-old waitress whose bright smile had been extinguished by violence. Janet Miller walked slowly past the apartment building where Debra had lived and died. Her steps careful on the icy pavement, but her purpose steady. At 80 years old, she moved with the deliberate grace of someone who'd learned to find peace within persistent grief. The building looked different now. Fresh paint, new windows, renovated apartments that housed young families and college students who knew nothing of the tragedy that had once defined this address. Life had reclaimed the space where death had briefly reigned, demonstrating time's power to heal even the deepest wounds. Janet paused at the front steps, remembering all the times she'd stood in this exact spot, waiting for news that never came, hoping for justice that seemed impossibly distant. Today felt different. The weight of unanswered questions had lifted, replaced by the lighter burden of simple remembrance. She pulled a single white candle from her coat pocket. Not the desperate flame of a vigiler, but the gentle light of a mother who'd found peace. The candle flickered briefly in the winter wind, then burned steadily as Janet whispered words meant for a daughter who could finally rest. "It's finished, sweetheart. He can't hurt anyone else. You can sleep now." The flame danced against the falling snow, illuminating Janet's face with soft light that revealed the lines time had carved, but also the serenity that resolution had brought. For the first time in 44 years, she wasn't waiting for something that might never come. Truth had arrived. Justice had been served. Love remained. Janet extinguished the candle and turned toward home, leaving behind the ghost that had haunted West 3rd Street for nearly half a century. Behind her, the apartment building stood quiet in the winter night, finally freed from the shadow that had lingered too long in its doorways. In the distance, church bells chimed midnight, marking the end of another day in a town that had learned to balance memory with hope, grief with gratitude, endings with new beginning.